A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Chapter 36. Johnny died 3 days later. He had gone to bed that night, and Katie had sat by him until he went to sleep. Later she slept with Francie so as not to disturb him. Sometime during the night he got up, dressed quietly, and went out. He did not return the next night. The second day they began looking for him. They looked all over, but Johnny hadn't been in any of his accustomed haunts for a week. The second night, McShane came over to take Katie to a nearby Catholic hospital. On the way over, he told her as gently as he could about Johnny. Johnny had been found early that morning huddled in a doorway. He was unconscious when a cop found him. His tuxedo jacket was buttoned up over his undershirt, and the cop saw the St. Anthony's medal around his neck and called up the Catholic hospital ambulance. There were no marks of identification on him. Later, the cop made his report at the station house and gave a description of the unconscious man. In the routine of checking the reports, McShane came across the description. His sixth sense told him who the man was. He went to the hospital and saw that it was Johnny Nolan. Johnny was still living when Katie got there. He had pneumonia, the doctor had told her, and there wasn't a chance. It was merely a question of hours. Already he was in the coma that came before death. They took Katie to him. His bed was in a long corridor-like ward. There were 50 other beds in the ward. Katie thanked McShane and said goodbye. He went away knowing that she wanted to be alone with Johnny. There was a screen connoting the dying around Johnny's bed. They brought a chair for Katie, and she sat there all day watching him. He was breathing harshly, and there were dried tears on his face. Katie stayed there until he died. He had never opened his eyes, had not spoken a word to his wife. It was night when she came home. She decided not to tell the children until the morning. Let them have a night's sleep behind them, she thought. One more night of griefless sleep. She told them only that their father was in the hospital and very sick. She said no more. There was something about the way she looked that discouraged the children from asking questions. Just as dawn came, Francie woke. She looked across the narrow bedroom and saw Mama sitting next to Neely's bed and looking down into his face. Her eyes were dark underneath, and she looked as though she'd been sitting there all night. When she saw that Francie was awake, she told her to get up and get dressed right away. She shook Neely gently to awaken him and told him the same thing. She went out into the kitchen. The bedroom was gray and cold, and Francie shivered as she got into her clothes. She waited for Neely, not wanting to go out to Mama alone. Katie was sitting by the window. They came before her and stood waiting. "Your father is dead," she told them. Francie stood numb. There was no feeling of surprise or grief. There was no feeling of anything. What Mama just said had no meaning. "You're not to cry for him," ordered Mama. Her next word made no sense either. "He's out of it now, and maybe he's luckier than we are." An orderly at the hospital was in the pay of an undertaker whom he notified as soon as a death occurred. This wide-awake undertaker gained an advantage over his competitors in that he went after the business while the others waited for the business to come after them. The enterprising fellow called on Katie early in the morning. "Mrs. Nolan," he said surreptitiously, referring to the slip of paper on which the orderly had written her name and address. "I sympathize with you in your grief. I give you a thought. What has come to you has to come to all of us." "What do you want?" asked Katie bluntly. "To be your friend," he hurried on before she could misunderstand. "There are details connected with the again a quick look at the slip. Mr. Nolan. I ask you to look on me as a friend who brings comfort at a time when... Who will? Well, I want you to leave everything in my hands." Katie understood. "How much would you charge for a simple funeral?" "Now don't you worry about the costs," he hedged. "I'll give him a fine funeral. There's no man I respected more than Mr. Nolan." He had never known Mr. Nolan. "I'll make it my personal business to see that he gets the best there is. Don't worry about the money." "I won't, because there's none to worry about." He wet his lips. "Aside from the insurance money, of course." It was a question, not a statement. "There's insurance. A little. Ah, he rubbed his hands together happily. There's where I can be of service. There's red tape connected with collecting insurance. Take a long time before you get the money. Now, supposing you, and understand I'm not charging you for this, let me take care of it. You just sign this, he whisked a paper out of his pocket, turning your policy over to me. I'll advance the money and collect on the policy. All undertakers gave this service. It was a trick to ascertain how much insurance there was. Once they knew the amount, the funeral cost 80% of it. They had to leave a little money for mourning clothes to keep the people satisfied. Katie got the policy. As she put it on the table, his practiced eye picked out the amount, $200. He appeared not to have looked at the policy. After Katie signed the paper, he talked of other things for a while. Finally, as if coming to a decision, he said, "Tell you what I'll do, Mrs. Nolan. I'll give the departed a first-class 4-coach funeral with a nickel-handle coffin for $175. That's my regular $250 job, and I'm not making a penny on it." "Why are you doing it then for?" asked Katie. He wasn't at all put out. "I'm doing it because I liked Mr. Nolan. A splendid man, and a hard-working man." He noticed the surprised look Katie gave him. "I don't know," she hesitated. $175. "That includes the mass, too," he put in hastily. "All right," said Katie dully. She was tired of talking about it. The undertaker picked up the policy and pretended to see the amount for the first time. "Say, this is for $200, he said in stagey surprise. "That means you got $25 coming to you after the funeral is paid." He dug into his pocket, stretching his leg out straight before him to do so. "Well, I always say that a little cash comes in handy at a time like this. At any time, if you ask me." He chuckled understandingly. "So I'll just advance you the balance out of my own pocket." He put $25 in new bills on the table. Katie thanked him. He wasn't fooling her, but she made no protest. She knew that was the way things were done. He was only working at his trade. He asked her to get the death certificate from the officiating doctor. "And please inform him that I'll call for the departed. Well, I'll come and get Mr. Nolan." When Katie went to the hospital again, she was taken to the doctor's office. The priest of the parish was there. He was trying to supply information for the making out of the death certificate. When he saw Katie, he made the sign of the cross in blessing and then shook her hand. "Mrs. Nolan can tell you more than I can," said the priest. The doctor asked necessary questions, the full name and place of birth and date of birth and so on. Finally, Katie asked him a question. "What are you writing down there? What he died from, I mean." "Acute alcoholism and pneumonia." "They said he died of pneumonia." "That was the direct cause of death, but his acute alcoholism was a definite contributing factor, probably the main cause of death if you wish the truth." "I don't want you to write down," Katie said slowly and steadily, "that he died from drinking too much. Write that he died of pneumonia alone. Madam, I have to state the entire truth. He's dead. What can it mean to you what he died of? The law requires—" "Look," said Katie, "I got 2 nice children. They're going to grow up to amount to something. If it isn't their fault that that he died from what you said. It would mean a lot to me if I could tell them that their father died of pneumonia alone." The priest took a hand in it. "You can do it, doctor," he said, "without hurt to yourself and with benefit to others. Don't be kicking around a poor lad that's dead and gone. Write down pneumonia, which is no lie, and this lady will be remembering you in her prayers for a long time to come. Beside," he added practically, "it's no skin off your teeth." All of a sudden, the doctor recalled 2 things. He remembered that the priest was a member of the hospital board, and he remembered that he liked being head doctor at that particular hospital. "All right," he conceded, "I'll do it, but don't let it get around. It's a personal favor to you, Father." He wrote down pneumonia in the blank after cause of death. And it was nowhere on record that John Nolan had died a drunkard. Katie used the $25 to buy mourning clothes. She bought Neely a new black suit with long pants. It was his first long pants suit, and pride, pleasure, and grief fought in Neely's heart. For herself, Katie got a new black hat and a 3-foot widow's veil according to the custom of Brooklyn. Francie got new shoes, which she had been needing for a long time anyhow. It was decided not to buy Francie a black coat, as she was growing fast and it wouldn't fit her next winter. Mama said her old green coat would do with a black band around the arm. Francie was glad because she hated black and had worried lest Mother put her into deep mourning. The little money left over after the shopping was finished was put in the tin can bank. The undertaker came again to report that Johnny was at his funeral parlor and was being fixed up fine and would be brought home that evening. Katie told him rather sharply not to give them the details. Then the blow fell. "Mrs. Nolan, I have to have the deed to your lot." "What lot?" "The cemetery plot. I need the deed to get the grave opened." "I thought that was all in the $175. No. I'm giving you a bargain. The coffin alone cost me—" "I don't like you," said Katie in her blunt way. "I don't like the business you're in." But then, she added with her amazing detachment, "I suppose someone has to bury the dead. How much is a plot?" $20. "Where in the world would I get—" She stopped short. "Francie, get the screwdriver." They pried up the tin can bank. There was $18.62 in it. "It's not enough," said the undertaker, "but I'll lay out the rest." He held out his hand for the money. "I'll get all the money together," Katie told him, "but I'll not turn over the money until I have the deed in my hand." He fussed and argued and finally went away, saying he'd bring back the deed. Mama sent Francie over to Sissy's house to borrow $2. When the undertaker came back with the deed, Katie, remembering something her mother had said 14 years ago, read it slowly and carefully. She made Francie and Neely read it too. The undertaker stood, first on one foot, then on the other. When all three Nolans were satisfied that the deed was in order, Katie handed over the money. "Why should I want to cheat you, Mrs. Nolan?" he said plaintively, as he put the money away carefully. "Why should anyone want to cheat anybody?" she asked in return. "But they do." The tin can bank stood in the middle of the table. It was 14 years old. Its strips were battered. "Do you want me to nail it back down, Mama?" asked Francie. "No," said Mama slowly. "We don't need it anymore. You see, we own a bit of land now." She placed the folded deed on top of the clumsy star bank. Francie and Neely remained out in the kitchen all the time the coffin was in the front room. They even slept in the kitchen. They didn't want to see their father in the coffin. Katie seemed to understand it and did not insist that they go in and look at their father. The house was full of flowers. The waiters' union, which had thrown Johnny out less than a week before, sent around an enormous pillow of white carnations with a purple ribbon running diagonally across it were the words in gold letters, "Our brother." The cops from the precinct, in memory of the capture of the murderer, sent a cross of red roses. Sergeant McShane sent a sheaf of lilies. Johnny's mother, the Romillys, and some of the neighbors sent flowers. There were flowers from dozens of Johnny's friends that Katie had never heard of. McGarity, the saloon keeper, sent a wreath of artificial laurel leaves. "I'd throw it in the ash can," said Evie indignantly as she read the card. "No," said Katie gently. "I can't blame McGarity. Johnny didn't have to go there." Johnny owed McGarity over $38 at the time of his death. For some reason, the saloon keeper said nothing to Katie about it. He canceled the debt silently. The flat was sickly with the combined scents of roses, lilies, and carnations. Forever after, Francie hated those flowers, but it pleased Katie to know how much people had thought of Johnny. A few moments before they were to close the coffin lid on Johnny, Katie came out into the kitchen to the children. She put her hands on Francie's shoulders and spoke low. "I heard some neighbors whispering. They said you won't look at your father because he wasn't a good father to you." "He was a good father," said Francie fiercely. "Yes, he was," agreed Katie. She waited, letting the children make their own decision. "Come on, Neely," said Francie. Hand in hand, the children went to their father. Neely looked down quickly, Then, afraid he would start crying, he ran out of the room. Francie stood there with her eyes on the ground, afraid to look. Finally, she lifted her eyes. She couldn't believe that Papa wasn't living. He wore his tuxedo suit, which had been cleaned and pressed. He had on a fresh dicky and collar and a carefully tied bow tie. There was a carnation in his lapel, and above it his union button. His hair was shining and golden and curling as ever. One of the locks was out of place and had fallen down on the side of his forehead a little. His eyes were closed, as though he were sleeping lightly. He looked young and handsome and well cared for. She noticed for the first time how finely arched his eyebrows were. His small mustache was trimmed and looked as debonair as ever. All the pain and grief and worry had left his face. It was smooth and boyish looking. Johnny was 34 years old when he died, but he looked younger now, like a boy just past 20. Francie looked at his hands, crossed so casually over a silver crucifix. There was a circlet of whiter skin on his third finger where he used to wear the signet ring that Katie had given them when they married. Katie had taken it off to give to Neely when he grew up. It was queer to see Papa's hands so quiet when she remembered them always trembling. Francie noticed how narrow and sensitive looking they were with long tapering fingers. She stared steadily at his hands and thought she saw them move. Panic churned up in her and she wanted to run away, but the room was full of people watching her. They would say she was running away because he had been a good father. He had. She put her hand on his hair and put the lock back in place. Aunt Sissy came and put her arm around her and whispered, "It's time." Francie stepped back to stand with Mama while they closed the lid. At the Mass, Francie knelt on one side of Mama and Neely on the other. Francie kept her eyes on the floor so that she wouldn't have to look at the flower-covered coffin standing on the trestles before the altar. Once she stole a look at her mother. Katie was kneeling, staring straight ahead, her face white and quiet under the widow's veil. When the priest stepped down and walked around the coffin, sprinkling holy water at the four corners of it, a woman sitting across the aisle sobbed wildly. Katie, jealous and fiercely possessive even in death, turned sharply to look at the woman who dared weep for Johnny. She looked well at the woman and then turned her head away. Her thoughts were like torn bits of paper blowing around. Hildy O'Dare is old for her age. It's like powder was sprinkled on her yellow hair. But she's not much older than me, 32 or 33. She was 18 when I was 17. You go your way, I'll go my way. You mean you'll go her way. Hildy. He's my feller, Katie Romilly. Hildy. But she's my best friend. I'm not much good, Hildy. I shouldn't have led you on. You go your... Hildy. Let her cry, thought Katie. Someone who loved Johnny should cry for him, and I can't cry. Let her. Katie, Johnny's mother, and Francie and Neely rode out to the cemetery in the first coach behind the hearse. The children sat with their backs to the driver. Francie was glad because she couldn't see the hearse which led the procession. She saw the coach which followed. Aunt Evie and Aunt Sissy were in that one alone. Their husbands couldn't come because they were working, and Grandma Romilly was staying home to mind Sissy's new baby. Francie wished she were riding in the second coach. Ruthie Nolan wept and lamented during the whole of the ride. Katie sat in stony quiet. The carriage was close and smelled of damp hay and stale horse manure. The smell, the closeness, the riding backwards, and the tension gave Francie an unfamiliar feeling of sickness. At the cemetery, there was a plain wooden box standing beside a deep hole. They put the cloth-covered casket with its shiny handles into the plain box. Francie looked away when they lowered it into the grave. It was a gray day, and a chill wind was blowing. Little whirls of frozen dust eddied about Francie's feet. A short distance away, at a week-old grave, some men were stripping the withered flowers from wire frames of the floral pieces heaped on the grave. They worked methodically, keeping the withered flowers in a neat heap and piling up the wire frames carefully. Theirs was a legitimate business. They bought this concession from the cemetery officials and sold the wire frames to the florists who used them over and over again. No one complained because the men were very scrupulous about not tearing off the flowers until they were well withered. Someone pushed a clump of cold, damp earth into Francie's hand. She saw that Mama and Neely were standing at the edge of the grave and dropping their handful of earth into it. Francie walked slowly to the edge, closed her eyes, and opened her hands slowly. She heard a soft thud after a second, and that feeling of sickness came back again. After the burial, the coaches went in different directions. Each mourner was to be taken to his own home. Ruthie Nolan went off with some mourners who lived near her. She didn't even say goodbye. All during the services, she had refused to speak to Katie and the children. Aunt Sissy and Evie got into the carriage with Katie and Francie and Neely. There wasn't room for 5 people, so Francie had to sit on Evie's lap. They were all very quiet on the way home. Aunt Evie tried to cheer them up by telling some new stories about Uncle Willie and his horse, but no one smiled because no one listened. Mama made the coach stop at the barber shop around the corner from their house. "Go in there," she told Francie, "and get your father's cup." Francie didn't know what she meant. "What cup?" she asked. "Just ask for his cup." Francie went in. There were 2 barbers, but no customers. One of the barbers sat on one of the chairs in a row against the wall. His left ankle rested on his right knee, and he cradled a mandolin. He was playing O Sole Mio. Francie knew the song. Mr. Morton had taught it to them, saying the title was Sunshine. The other barber was sitting in one of the barber chairs looking at himself in the long mirror. He got down from the chair as the girl came in. "Yes?" he asked. "I want my father's cup." "The name?" "John Nolan." "Ah, yes, too bad." He sighed as he took the mug from the row of them on a shelf, a thick white mug with John Nolan written on it in gold and in fancy block letters. There was a worn-down cake of white soap at the bottom of it and a tired-looking brush. He pried out the soap and put it and the brush in a bigger unlettered cup. He washed Johnny's cup. While Francie waited, she looked around. She had never been inside a barber shop. It smelled of soap and clean towels and bay rum. There was a gas heater which hissed companionably. The barber had finished the song and started it over again. The thin trickle of the mandolin made a sad sound in the warm shop. Francie sang Mr. Morton's words to the song in her mind. "Oh, what's so fine, dear, as a day of sunshine. The storm is past at last. The sky is blue and clear." Everyone had a secret life, she mused. Papa never spoke about the barber shop, yet he had come here 3 times a week to be shaved. Fastidious, Johnny had bought his own cup, emulating men who were in better circumstances. He wouldn't be shaved with lather from the common cup. Not Johnny. He had come here 3 times a week, when he had the money, and sat in one of those chairs and looked in that mirror and talked with the barber about, maybe, whether the Brooklyns had a good ball team that year, or whether the Democrats would get in as usual. Perhaps he had sung when the other barber played the mandolin. Yes, she was sure that he had sung. Singing had come easier than breathing to him. She wondered, when he had to wait, if he had read the Police Gazette lying on that bench. The barber gave her the washed and dried cup. "Johnny Nolan was a fine feller," he said. "Tell the mama that I, his barber, said this." "Thank you," whispered Francie gratefully. She went out, closing the door on the sad sound of the mandolin. Back in the coach, she held out the cup to Katie. "That's for you to have," said Mama. "Neely will have Papa's signet ring." Francie looked at her father's name in gold and whispered, "Thank you," gratefully for the second time in 5 minutes. Johnny had been on Earth for 34 years. Less than a week ago, he had walked on those streets, and now the cup, the ring, and 2 unironed waiter's aprons at home were the only concrete objects left to connote a man that had once lived. There were no other physical reminders of Johnny, as he had been buried in all the clothes he owned, with his studs and his 14-karat gold collar button. When they got home, they found that the neighbors had been in and straightened up the flat. The furniture had been put back in place in the front room, and the withered leaves and fallen flower petals swept out. The windows had been opened and the rooms aired out. They had brought coal and made a great fire in the kitchen range and put a fresh white cloth on the table. The Tinmore girls had brought up a cake which they had baked themselves, and it stood on a plate and was already sliced. Floss Gaddis and her mother had bought a whole lot of sliced bologna. It took 2 plates to hold it. There was a basket of freshly sliced rye bread, and the coffee cups were set on the table. There was a pot full of freshly made coffee warming on the stove, and someone had set a pitcher of real cream in the middle of the table. They had done all this while the Nolans were away. Then they had left, locked the door behind them, and put the key under the mat. Aunt Sissy, Evie, Mama, Francie, and Neely sat at the table. Aunt Evie poured out the coffee. Katy sat for a long time looking at her cup. She remembered the last time Johnny had sat at the table. She did what Johnny had done. She pushed the cup away with her arm, put her head down on the table, and cried in great ugly tearing sobs. Sissy put her arms around her and spoke in her gentle caressing voice. "Katy, Katy, don't cry so. Don't cry so, else the child you'll soon be bringing into this world will be a sad child."